When the Second World War ended in 1945, the headlines celebrated liberation. The Nazis had fallen. Hitler was dead. Europe was free again, or so the story went. But there was another side to that story. One that didn't make it into the victory parades. One that unfolded in places like Warsaw, Budapest, Prague, and Bucharest. Because while the German occupation was ending, a new kind of control was beginning, under a different banner, but with eerily similar results. This is the story of what happened after the Red Army rolled into Eastern Europe. And the question we're asking is simple. Did the Soviet Union really liberate these countries, or just replace one form of occupation with another? The Soviet Union played a massive role in defeating Nazi Germany. The Red Army pushed westward, absorbing enormous casualties. More than 20 million Soviet lives were lost in the war. When Soviet soldiers marched into Eastern Europe, they were hailed by many as heroes. They had helped crush fascism. They had ended the nightmare. When Soviet troops entered countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, they didn't leave. Instead, they stayed. At first, there was hope. Locals expected free elections, reconstruction, and a return to national independence. But what they got instead was a creeping takeover. When the Red Army entered Warsaw, they stood by as the Nazis crushed the Warsaw Uprising, refusing to help. And when the fighting ended, Soviet authorities arrested, imprisoned, or executed thousands of Polish resistance fighters. Poland didn't get to choose its government. The Soviets installed a communist regime loyal to Moscow, silencing opposition and rewriting the political landscape overnight. In Hungary, the pattern repeated. After the war, a multi-party system briefly re-emerged. But through a mixture of manipulation, intimidation, and outright fraud, the communists slowly consolidated power. Czechoslovakia had perhaps the most dramatic example. In 1948, communists staged a political coup, backed by pressure from Moscow. Non-communist officials resigned en masse under threat. Jan Masaryk, the country's foreign minister and a known moderate, mysteriously fell from a window to his death. The message was clear: there would be no neutrality in the new Europe. You were either with the Soviet bloc, or you were in the way. The methods weren't subtle. Secret police were established in every Eastern Bloc country, trained by Soviet advisors. Surveillance became a way of life. Political opponents were branded enemies of the state. Show trials and purges became common. In Romania and Bulgaria, land was confiscated. Dissent was criminalized. Tens of thousands were sent to labor camps. Many never returned. The borders were sealed. Travel became restricted. The Soviets didn't see themselves as occupiers. They saw themselves as protectors, building a buffer zone to prevent another German invasion. In their eyes, this wasn't empire building. It was survival. And yes, there were people in Eastern Europe who genuinely believed in socialism. There were workers who wanted reform, peasants who dreamed of land redistribution, and intellectuals who hoped communism would deliver equality. But that hope was quickly drowned in fear. By the 1950s, disillusionment was everywhere, and resistance was beginning to bubble. In 1956, Hungary exploded in revolution. Students and workers rose up, demanding democratic reforms and the withdrawal of Soviet troops. For a brief moment, it looked like change was possible. In Czechoslovakia, it happened again in 1968. The Prague Spring saw Alexander Dubček attempt to create socialism with a human face, introducing reforms and easing censorship. But the Soviet Union wasn't having it. Troops from 5 Warsaw Pact countries invaded. The reforms were reversed. And the message was clear: you do not challenge Moscow's authority. It wasn't until the 1980s that the cracks began to widen. In Poland, the Solidarity movement emerged, workers organizing outside state control. Led by Lech Walesa, it sparked a national conversation the government couldn't contain. In Hungary, reformists began opening up. In East Germany, protests grew louder. The legacy of Soviet liberation had left deep scars, economic, political, and psychological. So, was it liberation? Well, it depends on how you define that word. The Soviet Union did help defeat the Nazis. That's undeniable. They did end one of the most brutal regimes in history. But in doing so, they replaced it with a system that, for many, felt just as suffocating, just as controlling. The myth of Soviet liberation served a purpose, for propaganda, for pride, for rewriting history. But the reality is more painful, more complicated, and more honest. The truth is, some liberators never leave. And sometimes, liberation is just another word for control.